So Matthias, first of all, thank you so much for taking time out to talk with me this afternoon on this great subject of preaching. Can you just introduce yourself to us, a little bit about yourself and the ministry involved in, and then perhaps how you came to sense a call of God on your life to become a preacher?
Yeah, yeah, glad to do that. Yeah, so my name is Matthias Lohmann. I'm married to Sarah. We have two daughters. One is already out of the house, one still with us. I grew up in northern Germany in a Lutheran state church home, but unbelieving. So I didn't really know anything about the gospel. Went to church once a year on Christmas Eve. That was it. I thought I was a Christian. I didn't know anyone who was more or really Christian. So that was kind of my upbringing until I was in my mid-20s. While I finished my graduate studies at university, I met a girl who was a Christian who I tried to date, and she wouldn't, because I was not a believer in her assessment, which I questioned and challenged. And she eventually was willing to meet at her parents' home to tell me why she thinks that I'm not a Christian. And I don't remember really what she told me, but I realized during that conversation that I had no clue what she was talking about. And that kind of piqued my interest. It was more an intellectual interest, knowing more about Christianity, knowing more about the Bible. That set me on a journey. Eventually, I realized not all religions are the same. I started intellectually understanding the gospel, that Christianity is the only faith where people don't think they need to be good enough or even could be good enough to make it up to God, but that God actually had to come and rescue us. And that appealed to me because I started knowing myself well enough to know there's no way I could ever be good enough for God. So intellectually, I started believing, but I didn't want to change my life. So it took another few months and really a divine intervention in my life that caused me to become a Christian, age 26. In God's mercy, I moved away from my hometown the day I was converted. And started working for Siemens, big German company here in Munich, and that work brought me eventually in the same year, just 10 months later, to Washington D.C., where I started attending Capitol Baptist Church. Capitol Hill was a great place for me to grow under Mark Dever's preaching, so he was definitely one of the persons who shaped my thinking about preaching and about church generally. So that was really the way kind of into my walk with the Lord. And then the path to preaching followed pretty quickly after that. So I used to be a soccer player, and I initially just went for 9 months to Washington, D.C., and told my club I would be back and I would play again. But then I told them, look, I will not play on Sunday mornings anymore because I have something better to do on Sunday mornings. And our home games were typically Sunday 10:45. And they switched for stupid reasons. They thought I was still good. I wasn't anymore. I hadn't exercised for nearly a year, at least not in a way that I could still play at a competitive level. But they changed their home games to Sunday afternoon. And and I think it was probably the first game on a Sunday afternoon, warming up. I heard people on the outside, the spectators, talking about the guys just want to get drunk on Saturday, and so they only want to play on Sunday afternoons, and but nothing could be further from the truth. Back then, I wrote a column in a soccer magazine once in a while. So I wrote an article on why the church has the older rights on Sunday mornings and the more certain victory. That caused the Lutheran state church pastor of that locality to invite me if I would come and preach in his church. He's not, the captain of the local soccer team advocating that you should go to church. That's great. I had no clue what I should do. So I was only there for a few months. I was back in D.C. When I was back in D.C., I asked Mark Dever. And he asked me a couple of questions. He said, Matthias, can you tell me the gospel in 1 minute or less? So I did. And he asked me, Matthias, do you think this church knows the gospel? Is that a gospel-believing church? I said, no, I'm pretty sure it's not. Okay. Does the pastor know the gospel? So no, I don't think so. okay, do you think these people there need to hear the gospel? Do you want them to be saved? I said, yes, absolutely. So help me understand your question. You can articulate the gospel. There's a church where a pastor who doesn't preach the gospel to people who don't know the gospel, who need to hear the gospel in order to be saved, and you want them to be saved. So why wouldn't you go? So, all right. So I went and preached my first message.
Wow.
I had no idea what I was doing. I preached Romans 12, the whole chapter.
Great man.
And it was probably a horrible sermon. I still have a printout. I found it when I had to kind of, we just sold the house I grew up in, and I found the sermon script. I haven't dared to read it yet, but it's sitting here right behind me. And so anyway, long story short, after I preached, there was an old man back in the back corner of the church, and he was nodding while I was preaching. There were a lot of my friends who thought that's crazy. I moved away the day I became Christian, so they didn't see me as a Christian. They thought it's all a big joke. And so after the service, this man came up to me and said, "Young man, the gospel hasn't preached in these walls for 20 years. The Lord has given you a great gift. Do something with it." And I had it just ran down like a cold shower on my back, and I knew, okay, that was, in a way, was a sense of being called. Now, I thought that's 30 years in the future, but over the course of time, things moved forward quickly. So I was back in DC, met my wife, we moved to Berlin. Very quickly, we joined a church, bilingual church plant, and the church planting pastor, he was in his mid-60s. He had preached for the first few years of the existence of the church pretty much every Sunday. And he quickly realized that I was thinking theologically, that I had an interest in church and in preaching. So he asked me if I would meet with him to learn a bit more about preaching. And I think it was within 3 or 4 months that I started preaching in that church. And more people encouraged me to think about doing that full time. So eventually my wife and I moved back to DC. I went to RTS, Reformed Theological Seminary, has a small campus in DC. Yeah. I thought the best training ground for me is the church. So being back with Mark David, Capital Baptist Church.
Yes. And
attended seminary. And even before I was done with seminary, I was invited by the church here in Munich through strange connections that I won't go into detail, but that led me eventually to move into full-time ministry. So today, I'm the senior pastor, lead pastor of the Free Evangelical Church of downtown Munich, München Mitte, and have been here since 2008. I thoroughly enjoy it. I think that is where God wants me. I see how God is using my small gifting to do good things. And so I'm delighted to be here and to preach. We plant churches. This church is growing. And I got involved pretty quickly with a ministry called Evangelium 21, which is trying to really foster healthy churches, bring good, sound theology back into the heartland of the Reformation, where this is, in my mind, desperately needed.
Sure.
And so I've seen many other churches being impacted by that in good ways. So
great. That's great. Thank you. It always warms my heart when I hear different people's testimonies and their journeys, and they're all different, but they've all got similar components, of course, and it's great to hear. Yeah. Just a quick comment. In your present situation, can you give us a very quick, what's the state of the church in Germany these days?
Yeah, the state of the church in Germany today, in a way, is quite devastating. In the year 775, Germany became a majority Christian country and has been a majority Christian country ever since, at least nominally.
Yes.
And I think last year, for the first time, those who officially are still members of some church have become a minority in Germany. So it's less than 50%.
Okay.
Even in the 1970s, in West Germany, we had 98% of all Germans were members either of the Lutheran State Church or the Roman Catholic Church. Okay. Now that has gone down to less than 50%, and it keeps going down quickly.
Yes.
Because those who are still members, that's the old generation. So every year the church is dying.
Yes.
Further, and so that's the trend. The free churches, so the non-state churches, so Germany has a state church, the Protestant state church and the Roman Catholic state church. The free churches, like Baptist, free evangelical churches, Brethren churches, Pentecostal churches. The numbers there are not growing either. So you would think that they're picking up some of the people who are leaving the state churches, but that's not the case. A fair number of the denominations are becoming more liberal.
Yes.
So in the last 30 years, most of the bigger free church denominations have first adopted female pastors. Now they have given up on inerrancy by and large. They are now talking about sexual ethics and how far that should play a role. So the German Baptist Union has given churches free choice if they want to do gay blessings or think that practice homosexuality is sin. So the church is without any focus, without any orientation, without any real deep biblical roots.
Yes.
Now there are small churches that I think are against the trend, growing and are faithful, and so that encourages me.
Sure. Yeah.
I think a growing number of churches growing, and that's a very small number.
Yeah. Yeah.
In total, that's a couple of thousand. But you see in Hamburg or in Cologne or here in Munich, some other places, you see churches suddenly being strong again, young again, alive. And these churches are typically marked by the centrality of the gospel, the commitment to inerrancy, a clear understanding of gender roles, complementarian understanding.
Yes.
So they're good, a clear understanding that substitutionary atonement is the heart of the gospel, that you can't divorce ethics from theology.
Yes. Yeah.
And so that's encouraging. So there is a small remnant, but a growing remnant. One factor, I think, in the German church landscape that is an encouraging but strange factor is that we have this Russian-German group in Germany. So these are people who came from the former Soviet republics to Germany, but they came as people who called themselves German immigrants.
Okay.
So people who often, for hundreds of years, have lived somewhere in the East, and in the 80s, 90s came back to Germany. Some of them not speaking German, but kind of having German background. And many of them were Christians, kind of persecuted, or at least not having really a lot of liberty in what they were doing in the Soviet republics. And they came here, and they started their own little churches, and they grow. They have been growing for years now because they have a lot of children. They're positive. And I would say for the first 20, 30 years of their existence, I didn't even know they were there.
Okay.
Because they kept to themselves.
Yes.
They were not Russians, they were not Germans, they were Russian Germans. It's kind of their own breed. And I would say in the last 10 or possibly just 5 years, several of these churches have opened up much more. They've seen the next generation is much more German and is much more connected with German culture.
Yes.
And so some of them came out of rather legalistic, very conservative, more Armenian thinking backgrounds, and they have opened up, have discovered the doctrines of grace, have become more grace-filled.
Yes.
And they are reaching into the German culture. So that gives me hope. And it's a joy to see that. It's a whole new world for me.
Okay.
I've discovered in the last 5 years.
Yeah, it's great.
But anyway, yeah.
No, that's fascinating to look. I know very, very little about Germany at all and the church situation. So personally, I find that enormously fun and not dissimilar from UK. I mean, the sort of mainline denominations in UK have all really, sort of lost the plot, as I would say, in terms of connection with biblical truth, and with one or two exceptions, but the overall picture is very, very, very depressing, really. So, in fact, Church of Scotland, which is, in my opinion, completely apostate now, they've just appointed a new the St Giles Church in Edinburgh, which is what they call the High Kirk, is the central state church, and they've just appointed the man who was the first openly homosexual minister in Church of Scotland, who started the whole debate. So Knox's pulpit now is occupied by this man. and all the state occasions will take place with his, and it's a sort of metaphor for the whole church's decline, and it's tragic in the land of the book, as we used to be called over here, so. Yeah. But no, thank you for sharing that. Matthias, who were, and maybe or are now the main influences on your life as you became a preacher and discovered your own identity?
I would say generally for how I operate as a pastor, very clearly Mark Dever was a shaping influence.
Sure.
Just having been under his preaching and his pastoral work for 10 years off and on between 98 and 2008, that has shaped me. And I sometimes say when I grow up, I want to be a pastor like him. Still have a lot of growing up to do, but no, I see a lot of things that I think are exemplary in him. Probably don't preach quite like Mark does. There are a couple of things I do intentionally a bit different. And still he has shaped me even in my preaching. I would say Simeon Trust and Proclamation Trust, David Helm, Vaughan Roberts have definitely been important influences. Vaughan, more personally, we had him over here a number of times, and I got to know him. I heard him preach many times, and that has been very helpful for my preaching in thinking through how to go about the process of writing a sermon. Also, David Helm's book in the 9 Mark series, Expositional Preaching, has been very influential in my life. I probably, as so many others, I love hear John Piper preach. I love his passion, his joy in the gospel.
Absolutely.
So he definitely has been a great influence. And many others you would know, like Alistair Beck, or back in the days when Ligon Duncan was still serving as pastor, I listened to his preaching regularly. Kevin Young is someone I love to listen to. But also other people you would not know, people I know more locally, where I see certain aspects in that preaching that I aspire to. So even our youth pastor, a young guy whom I trained, he is so much better in giving color to a sermon. So he's very creative, but in a good way. So it's not overshadowing the biblical text, but it's really helping see biblical truths more clearly.
Wonderful.
So the way he does that, that is even a shaping influence by someone I trained.
Yeah, great. That's great.
I enjoy that a lot.
That's great. Yeah, I mentioned your comment about Mark Dever's influence on you, and we all have people like that who've been hugely influential. And yet, if I could picture up, you said intentionally, almost you differentiate from his style in one or two areas, because that's quite a hard thing, I think, for some people to do. Can you unpack that briefly, or?
Yeah, and again, he probably is right and I'm probably wrong, but his introductions to a sermon are in my thinking and possibly in my setting. He is in a different setting.
Yes.
In my setting, they're far too long. So I like to get to the text pretty quickly.
Okay.
He has shaped me by thinking, kind of front loading my sermon application, but I often do it more, by asking one or two questions or telling one brief story that gets us there.
Sure.
And that's typically it. Whereas he spends often 10 minutes doing that. So I'm not doing that intentionally. I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
I certainly aspire to preach the gospel as clearly as he does it every week.
Sure.
So that is something I'm fully on board, and that has definitely shaped my preaching very, very significantly. I would say I'm preaching not as long as he does. Probably because I'm not I'm not as gifted as he is as a communicator. So I'm trying to limit myself to, on average, 40 minutes, 45 max, and I think that's good for our church. That just is a few.
Yeah. That's great, because it's important that younger men under the influence of others learn to be themselves and adapt to their situation, and not simply, sometimes unintentionally, mimic or replicate what their mentor told them, but to think through the principles. But how do the principles apply for me and my situation?
Yeah.
That's helpful. Thank you. Thank you
And
so much.
I'm probably even louder and more
Okay.
animated than Mark Dever is. I think
Okay.
he's intentionally taking himself back
Right.
because he doesn't want his personality to overshadow the
Okay.
biblical text.
Yeah.
I probably do. I'm probably a bit more, anyway, I think I might be, especially when I preach in German. In English, I'm a different person when I
I
preach in English.
understand
When I
that.
preach
Yeah.
in German, I'm probably a bit more, I don't know,
Animated? Oh,
animated.
yeah. Okay. Right. So you notice a big difference when you're in German and English. Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I
Yeah.
mean, if we would do this interview in English, in German, I would probably sound a bit smarter.
Okay. You sound smart enough to be in your English, my brother. It's all right. Good for you. Matthias, looking back, knowing what you now know, what advice would you give to your younger self starting out as a preacher?
Get the main point of a passage, and then think about how to preach that point. I knew that. I mean, I grew up under Mark Dever, right? That's the whole thing. The expositional preaching is, making the main point of the passage, the main point of your sermon. I kind of knew it and I wanted to do it, and yet I think I didn't quite know how to do it well enough. And so I think Ron Roberts and David Helm both have helped me to spend more time really laboring over text, not just to figuring out all the things in the text, but really to first of all find what is the main point. And so one thing is finding the main point and preaching the main point, applying it well, and secondly, not to be too complicated. I think my early sermons were too complicated. I tried to communicate too much.
Yes. Yes.
And while I can see that this can be very helpful, we always have a fair number of non-Christians in our church. We have a lot of young Christians in our church, and we have a lot of non-native German speakers in our church. And I realized I need to be easier in how I preach. So I think over the years, my sermons have become easier, more focused. And I would say when I hear young preachers, not just how I used to preach, but generally when I hear young preachers, I often think they want to show us too much of what they know. They want to put too much theology in there, and they overload their sermons. Yes. And make them very complicated, and you kind of lose the main point, you lose the focus. You don't speak to the heart anymore because you speak so much to the brain and to so much of it. So that would be my advice to my younger self. Now, I understand that there are a lot of young preachers who would be well served to, first of all, generally preaching expositionally, even looking at the Bible faithfully, carefully, more. But yeah, anyway, that's probably
that's good. That's helpful. Yeah, thanks. What aspect of preaching? So I mean, preparation all the way to delivery. Do you find the most demanding, the most stretching, and has that changed over the years, or has it always been the same issue?
Yeah, I would say it's probably most Sundays is really finding the main point and finding a good way to apply it. Sometimes I start off and I think, oh, I have it.
Yes.
And 2 or 3 days later, I realize, I don't think I do have it. Sometimes I see so much, and yet I'm just not trying to get focus in this sermon. So I would say that most weeks, that's the hardest thing. Once I have a general outline, the actual writing of the sermon has never been difficult. I do script out my sermons, but I probably don't need to do that. It kind of keeps me focused. I don't use my script much, but I have one, and yeah, but that's the easier part. The harder part is really getting the structure.
Yes.
Sometimes I struggle. I see ways to preach the gospel from a text. Sometimes I have a hard time figuring out which is the best way to do it. Yeah, so I don't want to preach the gospel always kind of at the high point at the end of the sermon.
Yeah.
I don't think that does justice to what a text often does. So sometimes the gospel needs to come quite early in the sermon. But sometimes I have a text where I see, oh, it's so obvious I need to preach it here, and it's obvious I need to preach it here, but I don't want to preach, the gospel 3 times from an Old Testament text
Indeed,
in one sermon. So sometimes, so just last week, that was something I wrestled with as I preached. I'm right now going through First Samuel, and I'm kind of in the 20s. So 24 last week, 25 this week. So I could clearly see how the gospel could be easily preached, but how do I go about it? Where do I bring it? But yeah, that's most weeks. That's probably a bit more obvious for me than the general structure or the main point. But that can be a difficult part too.
Sure. Okay. You raise an interesting point, which I don't think I've raised very often with the other guys. Is the whole issue of script. So you generally have a fairly full script in front of you, but not necessarily use it all the time. It's there, but you're not engaged with that all the time.
Yeah. So I'm not a good script reader. I like to be very close to the church.
Yes.
And so I don't spend much time on my script. I also don't memorize my script. I memorize my outline.
Yes.
So I know what I will say. So typically I have Saturdays off, but on Saturday night I typically go through my outline, just laying in my bed. I'm just going through my outline, and I know where I want to go. I know what I'm doing. Then I'm fine. If I have a hard time on Saturday night remembering what I printed off on Friday night, I know I have to get up really early on Sunday morning. And that happens on occasion.
Okay.
So anyway, once I have that clear, I think I'm ready to go. But writing the script helps me to be careful in thinking every thought to the end.
Yes.
Not having loose ends.
Yes.
That would cause me to go on a tangent. And so once I've thought about it carefully, I know I can probably do it again, and I might not do it quite with the same words, or I might add or leave something, but I know I kind of have it under control.
Yes.
And sometimes there are Sundays where I'm just not as focused, and unfortunately we have outgrown our building, so I unfortunately have to preach against all my convictions on a Sunday. I preach at 9, 11, and 1 o'clock.
Okay.
So I preach 3 times. Sometimes at 1 o'clock I'm really tired and I lose track. And so it's good to be able to just go into the script for a moment and to kind of get my bearings again, and then I can go again. So it's good for me to have a script, and it helps me even in making sure I don't need one.
Yes.
Because I wrote it.
Yes. That's really helpful. I'm always saying to my students that I teach on preaching is whether or not you use a script is almost neither here nor there, but you need to have the discipline of writing it out word for word at some point in your process, because then you're more familiar with it, and as you say, you see weak spots, you finish off arguments and all the rest of it. And I think there's a tendency in some circles to move away from that, but I think that's critical. I think for all preachers, especially young preachers, they get into the discipline of it. And some of them find it quite tiresome, which I understand. But I think it's vital, absolutely vital. Yeah.
I do one other thing that requires me having a script. I ask every preacher who preaches in our church to give his sermon draft to someone else prior to preaching it.
Okay.
So feedback afterwards is great.
Interesting.
But I want to save the church from the mistakes.
Okay.
So feedback prior to preaching is something that I implemented.
Excellent.
And if I don't lead by example, then what I'm saying is not working. So I give my script to someone every week before I preach.
Okay.
So on either typically sometime on Friday, someone gets my script.
Yes.
Asks for feedback. And on the one hand, it helps my preaching to be better. People point out the weak spots, or where I've read and thought about it so much that I don't realize it's not immediately obvious to everyone else.
Okay. Yes.
So I'm very grateful for feedback I get, and sometimes I give it to our young guys, often I give it to my fellow pastors. So someone feedbacks my sermon pretty much every time I preach.
Great.
And again, I want this from everyone else. And obviously that only works if you have a script.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great idea. Great idea. Yeah. Matthias, one more question. What piece of advice would you give a young man coming to you and saying, I think God may be calling me into a preaching ministry, just about to start off? How would you guide them to start with?
There are a couple of different things. I mean, I have that frequently. We train pastors here. I would want to see, is he gifted in really finding the main point of a passage? I've seen so many guys who are good communicators.
Yes.
But they don't really get content across because they don't get it. And I think there are skills you can learn, but part of that is gifting too. And so I want to see both. Are they willing to learn, and do they bring a certain gifting?
Yeah.
But secondly, character is what I'm really concerned about. So I've seen guys who are very gifted and have preached great sermons, but I think their lives are really not helpful for what they want to do. And so I want them to have character, good godly character, so that what they're saying fits to who they are.
Yes.
Now I know we always preach better than we are. That's normal. I will not be able to live up to the standard of gospel preaching that I do.
Yes. Yeah.
And I will often say that in my sermons. I will put myself under the word and say, well, that challenges me personally. How about you?
Yeah.
You will hear sentences like that frequently from me. But if I constantly have to say, yeah, well, I tell people you should do this and that, but I don't, and I don't really care, well, that's a problem. And so I've seen too many young guys who like a stage.
Yes. Yes.
But who really don't love the people.
Yeah.
So I recently talked to someone whom I told that after 5 years of seminary studies, he did a bachelor in theology and now his master's of theology is not quite done. And I told him, look, I'm sorry that we are meeting now, but I don't think you should be a pastor. I don't think you're a good guy. You have good theology, but you don't speak to hearts of people. I don't see that you have a real spiritual concern for people. I think you have a concern for truth, right? But I don't see a pastor's heart. And so I don't think you should be a preacher, because I don't think we can divorce the teaching from the shepherding.
Absolutely.
So I want to see more of that. I think that's probably often the even bigger concern I have.
Okay.
Rather than someone who is not as gifted as a preacher, but faithful, good character, and leads by example, and is committed to the Word of God, and then I'm fine with mediocre preaching.
Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah, but I couldn't agree with you more. One of my biggest concerns, certainly in UK, in the training establishments, is all the focus is on competency, not on character. And the people coming out of seminaries and colleges going into pastoral ministries, and I don't claim any gift for this, but within 5 minutes of meeting them, I say to myself, you're not a pastor. You haven't got a pastor's heart. You haven't got a pastor's character. But it's been swept under the carpet because I've got a degree, I've got a qualification, and it's disastrous for the church. I know 2 or 3 churches that have literally closed because their pastor destroyed the place. Somebody should have taken them aside, as you were saying earlier on, and said, this is the wrong track for you. It's very sad. My brother, it's been a joy to meet you this afternoon. Thank you again for taking the time. Maybe one of these days our paths will physically cross. It'd be great to meet you one day. But the Lord continue to bless you and use you there in Munich, and as you have wider opportunities as well.
Thank you, John, and thank you for doing this, what you're doing. I think that's certainly a gift to many young pastors and learning more about preaching. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Matthias. Lord be with you, my brother.
And
okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.